I've always been interested in telling stories. I know that stories are important, and that thought is just reinforced the more stories that I learn. I think it's important to look at the stories of the past and present to find out what's important in society, what's changed, and what stayed the same. The digital age allows for more stories to come out of the woodwork and into the spotlight, and be examined and remixed and spit back out again. So this Lechuza zine is a sort of artistic case study promoting this process. Brujas and witches and folktales in many cultures are often used as a trope to show what women shouldn't be doing, but we can interpret these characters differently if we choose to. Surprisingly, the story of La Lechuza came to me in a roundabout way. Even though she is native to South Texas, I didn't grow up hearing about her. I first learned about her from a podcast. Despite being surrounded by Hispanic and Mexican culture in San Antonio, I totally missed out. I think this is a significant example of why representation is important, because the stories that I read and watched as a kid were so European-centric that I never even thought to ask any of my friends what their stories were like. I was a pretty naive kid, so as I absorbed stories, it was easy to start thinking that stories, or art or whatever, need to be a certain way, because that's how the stories that I've read are. I've always loved magic and fantasy and wonder, but the worlds in the fantasy stories that I read and saw are nothing like my world. You know, South Texas and the Texas Hill Country aren't anything like an idyllic European forest. But to me, it's just as beautiful and full of mystery. So why can't there be fairies in the cactuses and prairie grass and cedar trees too? I have a great love of my homeland, having grown up very connected to nature and the land. My family owns a ranch that has been in the family for over 100 years, and that land is an anchor connecting my immediate family and my ancestors. Wild West stories are pretty cool. I'm drawn to them because of my family's long Texas heritage, but for one, Hollywood cowboy stories are overwhelmingly white and male, and two, half the time they aren't even filmed in Texas. When I started learning more of my own Texas familial history and more incredibly diverse Texas stories, I started to wonder what it would look like if I combined those two things the Wild West genre lacked. Proper representation of Texas's diverse history, culture, and the actual countryside, and magic. The zine project about Lechuza originates from when I latched onto this idea, and I then started thinking about what it would be like to translate familiar fantasy tropes or Wiccan practices into a Texas mindset. If certain ideas are implicitly important to humans, how would the related symbols and signs manifest if they were cultivated in the Texas landscape? For instance, evergreen trees are a traditional symbol for midwinter celebrations because they represent continuing life during a harsh winter. Texas still has midwinter, but we have neither harsh, snowy winters or very many evergreen trees. So what would be the equivalent Texan symbol to an evergreen wreath? Cedar? Prickly pear cactuses? Things like that. I really love the idea of having all of my monsters and characters and whatever be influenced by stories and creatures that are Texas natives. So from there, the research into Texas folklore was pretty natural. I really wanted to expand the world of Langford Cove before I continued writing the comic. So for this scene, I decided to focus on folklore that I could use as an influence, and that I thought other people should know about. Eventually, that got narrowed down to La Lechuza because I thought she was pretty cool, and because she's from my neck of the woods. She's a legend that specifically originates in the border area of Texas. If you're north of San Antonio, you probably haven't heard of her. The story of La Lechuza being of Tejano origin raises some concerns I should address. I am white. I did, however, grow up in San Antonio, the culture of which throughout the whole city is heavily influenced by Mexican and Tejano culture. Obviously, I can't say that I am part of Tejano culture, but I can say that I am part of South Texas culture as a whole, and I feel connected to all aspects therein. Texas heritage is the only heritage that I have, and if my identity and my work are going to be influenced by that heritage, I think it's extremely important that I learn about and represent all the cultures that meld together to create that Texas heritage. I don't want to appropriate a culture that isn't mine, but the story of Texas is so predominantly not white that if I were to avoid cross-cultural stories, I would be perpetuating the whitewashing that Hollywood has done, and it wouldn't be representing the Texas that I know. When I decided on doing a zine about La Lechuza, I knew I needed to address this, and I decided that the best way to do that was to get first-person sources through the power of the internet. Because of our increased interconnectivity, I can skip right over most of the hard work that traditional folklorists had to do. Instead of going out and conducting interviews, I posted on the San Antonio subreddit and the South Texas subreddit. And my mother, bless her, also asked some of the employees at her work about what they knew. These direct stories are invaluable as cross-comparisons to the research I did. Because this legend is so localized and predominantly an oral tradition, it was nearly impossible to find any academic literature on it. in English anyway, and I knew that any random article I found on the internet was going to be watered down at best and unreliable at worst. I was right about that, because when I started researching it, it was obvious that most of the articles and blog posts were only referencing each other. Despite this, the core attributes of Lechuza in these articles lined up with the ones my sources told me. After this preliminary research, I was interested in the origins of the Lechuza story, and also more about the history of brujas in Mexico and Tejano folklore. I found an amazing article about the history of strigiform witches, bird witches, which talked about different bird witches across many cultures. According to the article, the original story about a witch who could turn into a bird was Greek, but there are examples all over the world. Sometimes they're owls, sometimes they're other birds. There are a few instances of owl witches in various Latin and Hispanic cultures, but when considering the origins of Mexican and Tejano stories, one has to also consider the influence of native cultures that were here before the Spanish came. Many native cultures consider owls to be omens of misfortune, so that could have been influence. However, the author observes that it's impossible to tell whether the owl witch was pre-Hispanic or if it was added to the pre-existing beliefs around owls when the Spanish showed up. Interestingly, according to this article, transforming into an owl is not the preferred form of a witch to take in Mexico in general. This is based on the informants that the author gathered, and only one informant mentioned owl witches in Mexico. That informant was from Monterrey. So following a hunch, I located the city on Google Maps and found that Monterrey is indeed a town close to the Texas border, further proving the exclusivity of the La Lechuza tale. However, surprisingly, there are almost identical stories from Mexico, and also instances of owl witches in Peru. I don't know if this means the story originated in New Mexico, and settlers brought it to Texas, or the other way around. It's strange because one might assume that since Lechuza is a border story, because of the proximity to Mexico, meaning it's a Mexican story that leaked into Texas, but it seems that it is an anomaly that originated elsewhere. My hunch is that maybe it could have come from a Native American story, from either of the appropriate regions, but it would take much more digging to figure out for sure. So Lechuza could be a few things: a bruja who transforms into an owl, or the familiar of a witch, or a vengeful spirit. A really common story archetype with her is a story of someone shooting down the owl, only to find the body of a woman later. Sometimes the body is found in a tree. One of my mom's co-workers told a story of the body of a woman being found in the trusses of a bridge. Other times an owl is shot, and then the suspicious woman in town is seen to be injured. From a few of the first-person accounts I read, she may not necessarily be a literal owl. It's just that owl is the best way to describe her. One of the stories that I read on Reddit described her as being so bright white that it seems like she's brilliant or glowing. But other times she's exactly the opposite, so black that it's like she's sucking the light away. In all the stories, the femininity of La Lechuza is very specific and important. She is always described as a woman, and she is often described as specifically targeting men. In the versions where she is a vengeful spirit, she is thought to have been scorned or abused by a man in a past life, which leads her to specifically targeting alcoholics and abusive men. This is held up by one of the stories I collected and included in the zine. An informant claimed that he was harassed by a Lechuza one night after he stayed out drinking too late, as he had been wont to do, and after that, he didn't stay drinking out again. Tangentially related, she also sometimes targets children, which makes her similar to a boogeyman story, but it also relates her to motherhood and maternal instincts. Because of her gender specificity, Lechuza also fits into larger tropes that span across folklore and stories in general. Witch characters are often a way of policing women, an example of what not to be as a woman. Because of the Catholic influence, the dichotomy of pure and impure women seems especially stark in Mexican folk stories. Folk magic and healing is an accepted thing, practiced by a word in Spanish that I don't want to pronounce incorrectly, but if a woman is practicing black magic, she's considered a bruja. This association with black magic is why some interpretations of La Lechuza say she is a woman who sold herself to the devil, or a demon, because that could also be used to describe brujas. Unfortunately, in many cultures, not just Mexican, what ends up being considered witchcraft or black magic is when women use knowledge that puts them outside of their pure or virginal role, like spiritual or sexual healing. Many women in the European witch hunts were pagan healers or midwives, and in Mexican history, women who practiced brujeria, I'm so white, I'm sorry, were disproportionately hated more than their male counterparts. In recent years, there has been a reclaiming of the word bruja by various communities and academics. I was amazed to find that there are many self-described brujas. Although the term may not be widely known in general, it does have a pretty big footprint in subculture and media. In light of these two things, the history of negative associations towards women that witch stories have, and the modern movement of reclaiming, I wanted to remix Lechuza's connotations a bit for the purpose of my fantasy world. In the world of Langford Cove, magic and monsters are part of the norm, which takes away the stigma around magic in general. In addition, in my retelling, I choose to emphasize the idea of Lechuza as a hand of justice, rather than as a chaotic force of magic. I emphasize that drunkards and abusers are particular targets. In my world of Langford Cove, I view Lechuza as a being of justice for those who commit violence against innocent parties, who should be feared not for their mere association with magic, but because of the power that they wield to bring punishment. Now, this is just my interpretation as an artist and a storyteller. I'm using Lechuza as a vehicle to show what is important in my story's world, and by extension, what is important to me. Stories both old and new are important, and I think it's possible and even responsible to use, remix, and reimagine old stories as a form of preservation, as long as it's done in a respectful way. It's closed-minded and unrealistic to think that traditions should stay the same. The natural evolution is beautiful and necessary. I do think it is important that old traditions and stories be remembered and cataloged in their original forms. Finding out the origins or versions of a story or myth is one of my favorite things to research. However, storytellers continuing the tradition by pulling from inspirational sources will ultimately make their stories more meaningful and rich. At the core of it, this project is about remixing. Remixing fantasy concepts with Texas, remixing traditional handicrafts with digital zine, remixing genre tropes to reflect ideas, stories, and characters that haven't been represented as much. Everything in Langford Cove's pocket guide is tied to something. From the plants I choose, to the colors, to the fonts, all the choices were made with care. I think and I hope that like-minded people will be able to find the meanings and feel the way that I feel, but that interpretation is up to you.